thank you so much for joining us for this very special event featuring Thrity Umrigar, author of our 18th Lake Oswego Reads book, Honor, as well as our youth book selection, Sugar and Milk. My name is Melissa Kelly, and as the city's library director, I'm honored to have the pleasure of welcoming you tonight to this very exciting event. It's an honor to welcome author Thrity Umrigar to visit Lake Oswego and speak with us tonight about the themes of her novel, her unforgettable characters, and her process as a writer. Following her brief introductory remarks at the lectern, Thrity Umrigar will be joined by fellow author and friend Sindya Bhanoo for an onstage conversation featuring questions submitted by our own community members through the library's website. We're also joined tonight by American Sign Language interpreter Sarika Mehta. Thank you. As the library director, I'm delighted to recognize and thank the amazing sponsors, staff, and volunteers who make this event in Lake Oswego Reads possible. Our title sponsors, the amazing friends of the Lake Oswego Public Library, the Lake Oswego Review, and the City of Lake Oswego. And our co-sponsors, the Lake Oswego Rotary Club and the Lakewood Center for the Arts. Woo! And an incredible group of local supporter sponsors who are detailed in our Lake Oswego Reads brochure and tonight's digital program. Please help me recognize all of our Lake Oswego Reads sponsors with a particularly huge round of applause. Thank you. If you have enjoyed Lake Oswego Reads and the library's other educational and cultural events, you can also support this high-quality programming by becoming a friend of the library. Join today. Furthermore, it is my pleasure to recognize the tremendous efforts of our 18-member Lake Oswego Reads Steering Committee, composed of local teachers, retired professors, exceptional high school students, librarians, and other leaders in our community. This group reads, discusses, and helps to consider many titles each year to select a really amazing book for our community-wide reading program. I want to also thank our Lake Oswego Reads Events Committee for their efforts each year to partner with community groups to develop a month-long series of programs that support the themes of the book. In particular recognition is due to our tech support team, thank you, and to our incredible volunteer and special events coordinator at the library, Nancy Nyland. Yes. Nancy's enthusiasm and commitment brings all of the staff and volunteers together each year to bring Lake Oswego Reads to fruition. We're very grateful. Thank you again to our sponsors, our volunteer committee members, our community partners, and our hardworking staff for making Lake Oswego Reads such a valuable educational and community building opportunity for Lake Oswego each year. Please join me in giving them another huge round of applause. And now, what we've all been waiting for. It is my privilege to introduce our guest of honor. Thrity Umrigar is the best-selling author of the novels Bombay Time, The Space Between Us, If Today Be Sweet, The Weight of Heaven, The World We Found, The Story Hour, Everybody's Son, The Secrets Between Us, and Honor. She's also the author of the memoir, First Darling of the Morning, as well as children's books, Sugar and Milk, When I Carried You in My Belly, and Binny's Diwali. Her books have been translated into several languages and published in over 20 countries. Thrity was born in Bombay, India, and came to the US when she was 21. After earning an MA in journalism in the US, Thrity worked for several years as an award-winning reporter, columnist, and magazine writer. She also earned a PhD in English. In 1999, Thrity won a one-year Nieman Fellowship to Harvard University, which is given to mid-career journalists. While at Harvard, Thrity wrote her first novel, Bombay Time. In 2002, she accepted a teaching position at Case Western Reserve University, where she's now the Armington Professor of English. She also does occasional freelance pieces for national publications and has written for the Washington Post and the Boston Globe's book pages. Thrity is active on the national lecture circuit and has spoken at book festivals such as the LA Festival of Books, the Tucson Book Festival, and the Miami International Book Fair. At universities such as MIT, Harvard University, and Spelman College, and at literary societies, civic and business organizations, and public libraries all across the country. And we're thrilled to now have her speak with our community. Without further ado, please welcome our special guest, Thrity Umrigar, to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. You know, on my drive here from the hotel just a few minutes ago, I was looking at all the greenery. I live in Ohio. We are about a month behind you in terms of the arrival of spring. And that line from that old movie went through my head, the line that says, "Is this heaven?" No, it's Lake Oswego. So thank you so very much from the bottom of my heart for this great welcome. I don't have to tell you that you have an incredible community here, a community of readers, a community of lovers of literature, and some fantastic people. I have to thank Nancy, who has been valiantly driving me around all day today, but also all the artists who produced incredibly beautiful artwork based on my novel, Honor. You know, I've been doing this for over 20 years now, and I have to tell you that no organizer has ever had a group of local artists produce artwork based on one of my novels. It's a moment and an experience that I will never forget. And with that, I'm going to go hop on a seat right there and talk to you in a minute's time. Excuse me. That's it. I feel like the Godfather sitting in one of these chairs. Wow. Anybody want to kiss my ring?
And at this time, I'd like to welcome Sindya Bhanoo to the stage. Thank you.
Hello, Thrity. It's so great to be here with you today. Am I echoing like crazy? I hope the mic is working properly. Before we start, I just wanted to tell the audience that I picked up Thrity's first book 20 years ago. I was in college, I think, Bombay time, and it was so inspiring, and it was among the first books that I read with South Asian characters in it, and so it's such a privilege to be here with you today. Many in the audience have read the book and they've shared their questions, and so I'll be using their questions as a guideline, but I thought maybe you could start by telling us how you came up with the idea for Honor.
For Honor, yeah. So Honor originated with me. Yeah, I too feel like there's an echo in here. Are we okay? Are we deafening you guys? It's all right?
Okay.
All right. So sometime in maybe 2016 or so, I came across a series of articles set in rural India in the New York Times, written by this fabulous reporter by the name of Ellen Berry. And one of the articles that she wrote in particular really caught my interest. And this was an article that described the efforts of a small but very valiant group of women in rural India, in a small village somewhere, who decided to seek employment outside their home. And for this minor act of courage, in my opinion, but transgression in the eyes of the community that they lived in, it was like the wrath of the village and the village elders descended upon them. And some of the things that Ellen described in that article in terms of the kind of punishments that were meted out to these women, it just stunned me. You know, I truly had no idea that that kind of thing was still happening in the countryside in India. And all I remember thinking in terms of sort of converting a factual journalistic report into art, all I remember thinking at that time was simply, wow, somebody should make a movie out of this story. You know, it would be a great cinematic experience. It never occurred to me that it should be fictionalized in terms of a novel, much less that I would be the author of such a book. But a year or so went by, and I found myself thinking back to that story, and specifically about those women, because the article sort of cuts off abruptly, and you never really find out what ultimately happened to them. And for me, that's always a sign of when a book is ready to be baked, so to speak, when it keeps nagging at you in some way. And, you know, and I've learned to trust that process. And so, you know, when the time came, I just thought, yeah, this is a story I want to tell. And that's how the character of Meena, who's one of the two major characters in the book, was born. And then I wanted a kind of counterpoint to Meena and her very tragic story. And hence I came up with a character called Smita.
Mm-hmm. And so we meet Smita, who's an Indian-American journalist who comes to India. She ends up covering this story, which is about Meena and her husband. And the title of the book is Honor, and there's an honor killing in the storyline. But how did you kind of come up with the title, and how does it speak to various aspects of the book?
Yeah, to be perfectly honest with you, this is one of my only books where I had the title from the get-go, and it never changed. You know, as you know, sometimes what happens is you have a working title to a book, and you send it off to the publisher with that title, and they come back and they say, no, the marketing department realized it's not a commercial enough title, so you got to change it. And inevitably, when they tell you that, they give you about 15 minutes in which to come up. I'm exaggerating, but they usually give you a day in which to come up with a new title. But this book was called Honor for obvious reasons. I mean, as you alluded to, it does feature an honor killing, so for that reason. But more importantly, I think it was really important for me to reclaim that word, to kind of snatch it back from Meena's brothers, for instance, who believe that they are the wrong party and that they have had no choice but to do what they have done as a way of restoring the family honor, the family name. And I wanted to take that word, that beautiful word, back from them and present it to the people to whom I think it really belongs, to Meena, to her husband, Abdul, and to some extent to Smita also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the child.
And the child.
Meena's daughter. So you're a journalist, and one of the you come from a journalism background, as do I, and one of the protagonists, Smita, is a journalist. What were some of the challenges that you experienced in writing this novel, which is based on news that you saw, which contains a news story? What were the most difficult parts of writing this book?
You know, I didn't really have a very hard time writing the Smita sections, because even though Smita and my life stories, thankfully, are very different, you know, she's familiar to me. I mean, she has lived most of her life in this country, as have I. She's a upper middle class, educated, urban woman, as I am and was. So it didn't feel particularly challenging telling Smita's half of the book. I did borrow a little bit from my own journalism career. I mean, I never had the kind of glamorous journalism career that Smita did. But one of the sort of issues that I had Smita grappling with throughout the book, which is this concept of objectivity in journalism, was something that I battled with throughout my journalism career, because I was drawn to subject matter fairly similar, frankly, to the kind of subject matter I'm drawn to as a novelist today. I wanted to write about people who didn't have a voice. And I had this ongoing battle with myself about, do the rules of objective journalism, which after all were early 20th century invention by wealthy white men, do those rules really apply to situations like Mina's, for instance? Or when I was writing about welfare mothers in Akron, Ohio, does it translate? And since I could never fully resolve that question for myself, I thought, here, I'll just take this hot potato and throw it in Smita's lap, and see what she does with it.
Yeah, and we see her grapple with it, and we sort of see her thoughts on this change as the book progresses. Right. And at one point, she's okay with Mohan, the person who's accompanying her, giving some things to Mina's mother-in-law. And then later she gets to a point where she wants to send money back from the US. Right. And what would you have done in Smita's situation as a journalist? Had you...
It's a tough one,
Yeah.
I don't really have a good answer. I mean, on one hand, we are seeing with the rise of cable news and television how ridiculously one-sided every channel seems to be, and that certainly doesn't seem to be anything to aspire to in terms of print. But like I said earlier, I think a little bit of advocacy, a little bit of flexibility is not a bad idea, But in terms of giving actual money to people, I mean, Smita is lucky in that she has Mohan accompanying her, and he's not a journalist. He's free to do whatever he wishes to do, and all she has to do is turn a blind eye to what he does,
Yeah, yeah, and Mohan and Anjali, the lawyer, are sort of side characters in the novel, but they're complex as well, and they also have to grapple with these issues in society of being an upper class privileged man and approaching these communities with respect. And the lawyer too, I think, is sort of grappling with issues too. Is Mina just an example that she's going to use? So how did you think about those characters?
Mohan is probably my favorite character in the novel because Mohan reminds me a great deal of the men that I grew up with in India, cousins, uncles, people like that. Just good-hearted, well-meaning, decent men who want to do the right thing. But like all of us, I suppose, Mohan has his blind spots also, right? He's raised to believe India is the greatest country in the world. What I wanted to do with his character was sort of act as a counterpoint to Smita's absolute revulsion towards India, So I wanted the starting points for both of them to be sort of polar opposites, in terms of their love-hate relationships with India. And then hopefully by the end of the book, they've both grown a little bit. And it's a more nuanced, more complicated relationship with the country of their birth, where they can see what doesn't work and what's wrong and needs fixing, but they can also see the beauty and the warmth of the people and, the goodness of the place.
Yeah, and what about Anjali, the lawyer?
Yeah. Anjali is, as you said, she's a more complicated character because she's wearing two hats. She may not know that, but I think she's wearing two hats. I mean, one is definitely that of a lawyer trying to do good, trying to change the criminal justice system, one case at a time. But she's also a political activist, and sometimes, perhaps, I'm not sure of this, but perhaps those two roles contradict each other or are in conflict with one another a little bit, But there's no question in my mind that the world needs to be filled with people like Anjali who are fighting the good fight. You know, I mean, she's clearly a good person.
Yeah. A question that some readers have is about how you keep a balance between storytelling and if you were doing this, delivering a kind of moral lesson or idea to your readers. And I don't know if you're even doing that, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think for me, the only thing that I owe allegiance to when I'm writing a book, and I'm sorry to disappoint all of you with what I'm about to say, but it's not to the reader, it's to the story itself. It's to the book itself. It's, you know, everything that you do as a writer has to be in service to the story. And when you think about what storytelling really is, if you really break that down, it's really about the characters and the character development, you know? So if I feel that something that I, as a person, as a human being, might believe, but if I feel that that might also be something that one of my characters believe, then I have no problem having them say that piece, you know? But if there is anything that I believe and a character that I've created, you know, would never in a million years can I imagine them feeling that way, acting that way, then they won't do that, you know? So for me, you know, I know there are writers for whom plot is extremely important, and plot is important. I mean, it's part of storytelling, but I always trust that plot will appear. If I just really get to know my characters well. You know, plot to me is simply what happens organically when two characters brush up against each other. That's plot, you know? So for me, my first, second, and final allegiance is to character development and the story itself.
Yeah, and maybe, so staying on this topic and shifting slightly maybe to your writing process a little bit more, what happens to Meena is very tragic later in the book. How did you arrive on that, and how did you know that is a plot point in the book? How did you arrive on that and know it was the right ending to her story?
Yeah, I'm trying, you know, you're asking questions about a book that I wrote almost 5 years ago. So I think I mean, I'm not sure that what I'm about to say is actually what I'm remembering.
Yeah.
But what I do know is obviously my own writing process. And, you know, when I start a book, I never sit in front of the computer and say, okay, what happens next? I never do that. So I go for long walks. I take ridiculously long showers in which I, you know, write dialogue and write scenes and things like that. I do everything other than sit in front of a computer. And I do that for a few weeks before I even start writing at all. And what happens by doing that is I really sort of absorb the story. I start occupying it, you know, and it starts occupying me. And then just the way my brain is wired, I mean, obviously if you say, okay, so this person's favorite color is red, I'm just making this up. I don't know where I'm going with that even, but then what does that mean? What has to logically follow if their favorite color is red? And you just get the ball rolling, you know? Mm-hmm. So I think probably very early on, I knew what the shape of this book was going to be, and that it would involve something tragic happening with Meena and to Meena. So I think once you know your character and once you know the place is really important too. Once you know the milieu in which this character lives, you know, again, you do it without compromising, right? It might be a prettier ending if the tragedy does not occur. But when when you put together everything that you know about a place, when you know the characters of the brothers, you know, how will they react to a specific development that happens, you know, 20 pages earlier. So, you know, books sort of they follow the dictates of their own logic also, you know.
Yeah, and as you describe the process, it reminds me of what a reporter's process is, going out into the field and taking notes, and you have your years of being a newspaper reporter behind you. But it sounds like you gather information about these. You have an idea. You always go in with an idea, it sounds like. Right. But then you're gathering a lot of information.
Yeah, I think that's well said, yeah.
Let's see. Another question that people have is about whether there might be a continuation to this story of Smita and Mohan.
I'm sorry, I missed
a continuation to this story, whether you might end up writing a sequel sometime.
The short answer is there's no plans to do a sequel at the moment. The longer answer is never say never. You know?
You've left the opening there, though, I think. Because
not intentionally, you know. I thought, you know, if you read some of my earlier books, they really leave you guessing as to what happens next, to the extent where when I used to do book talks like this, readers would come up to me and say, you know, I belong to a book club, and we have this practice of writing an extra chapter after the book ends, you know. And then they would proceed to tell me what I should have done with one more chapter, you know. And look, you can say many things about me, but when readers talk, I do pay attention. So of late, I've made a more deliberate and conscious effort to, you know, have a more resolved ending. I mean, as a reader, I love books. I love movies that just go to black, you know, that just cut you off and leave you wanting more. And that used to be the way I wrote several of my earlier books. But I feel like this is pretty wrapped up, the story.
I have to say, I was at the Texas Book Festival with Thrity in 2022 when Honor came out. And we were signing books side by side, and she had such a long line. Thrity had this line that was endless. People wanted her to sign books, but there was one super fan who brought all 8 of Thrity's books that she had collected over the course of 20 years to get signed. It was really amazing.
Yeah. I remember that. Yeah.
I would like to ask you about Bombay. Bombay appears, this story takes place in Bombay, but it appears in your other work as well. This is a very modern Bombay that we're mostly in, and I'm curious, Mumbai now, and I'm curious how you rendered this modern Mumbai on the page, and also maybe you also write about the Bombay that you know when we go back into Smita's past.
So it's a very good question. I mean, clearly I have not lived in Bombay for 40 plus years. You know, I do still have some family there, and I do occasionally make trips there. But I'm pretty sneaky about how I write about Bombay now. And what I mean by that is I try and write about the things that don't change, you know. So I have one more book that came out last year after this, and I only bring that up. It's called The Museum of Failures, and that book is really, the entire book is set in Bombay. I mean, there's some parts that are set in the US, but for the most part, the book is set in Bombay. And it's very much in present time. It's set in 2019. So almost all my Bombay books have a scene set by the ocean, because that's, you know, the ocean in Bombay is sort of what's dearest and nearest to my heart. That's where I spent almost not every evening of my life, but my childhood, but quite a bit. So I have very fond memories of that. I try and write about the things that are timeless. I don't write about whatever the fad is at the moment or whatever the pop song is at the moment, because I don't really know that aspect of Bombay anymore. But I write about the ocean, I write about the sky, I write about language, I pay really close attention to how language evolves and changes when I go back. Just even colloquial speech, just the way my relatives now, new phrases that enter the lexicon, that kind of thing. So that's how I get away with it, basically.
And the very famous Leopold's Cafe also appears in the
That's
book.
right, yeah.
Is that a place that you frequented ever when you were young?
Oh, very much so, yeah.
What are you working on now? What new book are you working on?
I'm sort of kind of maybe perhaps working on another novel.
Yeah.
It's a love story that pretends to be a mystery, that pretends to be an examination of personal, a marriage basically. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit of a mishmash, and that's deliberate. I just wanted to try my hand at a different kind of genre writing, if you will, a mystery novel. But it's a ridiculous mystery novel because I basically tell you in the first 50 pages what has happened. So it's not really a mystery novel. I don't know what I'm doing. I need to take longer showers.
Well, will you tell us a little bit briefly about the Museum of Failures?
Sure, that's easier to talk about because that's done. So the Museum of Failures tells the story of this young man who has a successful advertising agency in Columbus, Ohio. And he goes back to India for what's meant to be a very short trip. He and his wife, Kathy, are planning on adopting a child from India. He's Indian American. And while he's there, he knows he has to pay a visit to his mom. He doesn't tell her that he's coming because he's always had a very difficult relationship with his mom. And when he goes there, to his surprise, he finds out that she has just been admitted to the hospital. So the whole adoption thing sort of takes on a life of its own, but the story kind of twists into this thing of what does he do? So he ends up staying longer. And while he's in India, he discovers a family secret that completely upends his life and makes him think of the city of his birth, which he has always thought about as the Museum of Failures. His own sad childhood because of his difficult mom has colored his vision of the city of his birth. So basically, it's growing up time, and he has to reassess every aspect of his life.
And what got you thinking about what that book would be and then become? Was it this? Were you exploring the city, the Bombay that he?
Yeah, that's a good question. How did Museum of Failures come about? I think. Oh, I know how it came about. I saw a movie called The Farewell. Have any of you seen it? It's a great movie. It's really worth renting. It's sad. It's funny. It's just It's about this Chinese American family where the whole family from New York goes to China because they get word that their grandmother is dying. And there's a scene in that movie towards the end where they are on their way to the airport, after having visited her. The grandmother is ill. She doesn't know that she's ill. The family decides to keep it a secret, but they know that it's probably the last time that they're going to see her. So there's the scene, Leonard Cohen's song, Come Healing, plays in the background, and they are all just shedding tears on their way to the airport. And something about that scene just really got to me. I mean, like, slayed me, you know? And I got out of the movie theater thinking, there's something here. You know, anything that produces such a strong reaction, it means something. And then I thought, and this was, you know, this was around 2019. We all know what was happening in the country around then. You know, the wall was going up and all that. And I just thought, you know, maybe people who are lucky enough to be born and raised in one country, who have never known, you know, really the opportunity for sure, but also the sadness of immigration. Maybe art can soften hearts, you know, maybe there is a way to convey to people that even if you come here under the best of circumstances, which somebody like me most certainly did, you know, I came here with every conceivable opportunity, and yet there is a price that you pay for that, you know?
Yeah.
And I just felt like I wanted to write a book that dealt with all that.
Yeah.
So at that time, it was just a feeling. It wasn't an idea, it was just a feeling.
Coming back to honor, we spoke about these sort of minor characters, Mohan and Anjali. I wanted to ask you a little bit about religion. Hindus and Muslims are at the center of this story, but there's also Beatrice auntie, who's Christian. There's also the Parsi auntie, whom Mohan lives with. And so we get the sense of the multitude of religions that exist in India. And you bring that to life on the page, but could you talk a little bit maybe about how you were thinking about the roles of these major religions in India and then these somewhat more minor ones?
Sure. So I kind of occupy a no man's land in India, or did when I lived there, and my family certainly did, in that we were not Hindu, we were not Muslim. We belonged to this ridiculously tiny community called Parsis, practitioners of an ancient faith called Zoroastrianism. That's a brief history lesson. So my ancestors came to India from what used to be Persia, what today is mostly Iran, 1,000 years ago, and made their home in India, and were let in by the Hindu ruler of this region, who just asked them for one thing, one promise in exchange, which was that they would not be disruptive, that they would adopt the values and the culture of what is predominantly a Hindu nation. And they agreed, and the rest, as they say, truly is history. But for me, as somebody who grew up in India mostly in the 1970s, came of age then, and certainly specifically in the city of Bombay, which is probably the most cosmopolitan, westernized city in India. It was a matter of pride to live in a city that was very secular-minded, very intellectual in some ways in those days. But it was truly a melting pot. It was a hodgepodge of different groups, and people, for the most part, got along, which is why the incident that I talk about in honor, as it pertains to Smita's family, was such a shock to middle-class Bombayites, because we just grew up with this rather arrogant belief that whatever happened in the rest of India sort of stayed in the rest of India, and we in Bombay were somehow immune to all of that, you know, the religious infighting and all that. But yeah, I mean, this has been the genius of India for 1,000 years, right? That it could absorb foreign influences and yet only strengthen the core of the country. So it's a heritage and a value, that I value very much.
And we have this character in the book who is the head of the small village where Meena lives. His name is Rupal, and he's sort of the zealot who is
Right.
who is instigating all of this. And we see that her brothers have done something terrible to her husband, to Meena's husband, but behind them is this other voice, and so. Because of that, I felt that I could see some humanity in the brothers. I'm not sure I saw it in Rupal, but I think that what you indicate is that it's something else that's driving this, that's coming from another place. But maybe you could talk a little bit about the rise of this sort of mentality in India.
Well, I mean, so Rupal is basically, he is a politician, He's head of the village council, but he's like a local chief. And if you think about it, I mean, I think most of the problems that we see in the world is because some leaders, pit people against one another. I mean, the British famously did that in India, not just in the way it all culminated with partition. Many of you, I know, are familiar with that, but just in the way they ruled India. They famously proclaimed divide and conquer as a kind of governing philosophy. There were many, many instances of Hindus and Muslims living side by side for hundreds of years in India with none of what we see today. So I believe that poison has to be injected into the body politic. It doesn't just happen, naturally. And Rupal is just a microcosm or a very small example of that kind of pitting groups of people against one another.
There's a line in the book, and it's, "The most dangerous animal in the world is a man with wounded pride." And I feel like maybe Rupal plays with that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure.
To get what he wants. I wanted to ask you a little bit about what we talked about, or you already mentioned that you're not thinking of delivering a message to the readers as you're writing. You're trying to stay true to the story and true to the characters in the story. But at the end of it, is there anything you want readers to take away with them as they go on? Yeah.
I mean, I think you will agree with this. I think as writers, our number one job is to tell a good yarn. You want your book to be engaging, you want it to be entertaining in some ways, you want people to turn to the next page, right? So it always feels a little presumptuous to even let myself imagine what I hope a reader will take away from any of my books. But since you asked the question,
they asked the question.
They asked the question, even better. Just to acknowledge people's humanity, to realize that yes, there's 8,000 miles between America and India, and there's probably 100,000 miles in terms of development and culture and all of those things. But ultimately, we are all fruit, quoting another movie line. So just that recognition. I mean, the one thing I always fear when I write about India, and especially talk about the less savory aspects of Indian life, is that an American reader will sort of read those books and say, oh, those people over there, look how badly they treat one another. I never want that to happen. What I hope for instead is precisely the opposite. You know, that one can look at the blind spots of a certain culture and see our own culture in that, you know, and say, okay, now I know what's happening over there, but closer to home, what are our blind spots, you know, to see ourselves. And I don't just say that to sound airy-fairy. I say that because that's my lived experience, you know. When I was a teenager in India, I mostly read American authors, you know. I grew up reading Hemingway and Steinbeck and Faulkner and Fitzgerald, and it never once occurred to me that I was reading about a different culture, because all I saw was the common humanity, you know, and that's my hope, always.
Yeah, and I think that a character like Meena, in your book, through your pages, we can kind of get a better sense for what her day-to-day life was like, moments which wouldn't appear in a news story, the moments after the death of her husband. And so that does allow us, I think, to see her humanity. I'm wondering about the really painful and difficult moments in the book. And these are things that happened to Meena and her husband, but also to Smita and her family, and ultimately leads to them leaving Bombay and India forever. I'm wondering about those scenes, and they're difficult to read as a reader, and I know many people probably experienced what I did. I think it's difficult to kind of process that material, but writing it, I imagine, also would have been quite challenging.
Yeah, it was. I'm not gonna lie about it. I mean, that scene towards the end, as it pertains to Meena, you know, it's interesting what happens, like when you're writing about violence, especially, you know, it affects you emotionally, right? You leave your desk at the end of that writing session feeling disturbed. It carries into your family life, into your normal life. But it's strange, there's a duality there, because even while you're feeling the emotional weight of that scene, you are also in the process of creating that scene, right? So there's a technical aspect that runs parallel to the emotional aspect. I don't know if I'm saying this right, but you know, I had to ask myself, what does it feel like to hit another human being? I've never done that. I don't know what it would feel like to throw a punch. You know, like in my body, what would it feel like? And what would it feel like to receive a punch, right? So you're like an actor who's playing both roles, and you're writing that down from both sides, and you're feeling the burden of that, right? So yeah, those things are hard to do.
Yeah, and I think that in doing that, I mean, we're talking about seeing the humanity in our characters. It also connects us to our characters. We have to experience what they're experiencing, I think.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe I would love for you to end by talking a little. You mentioned the writers you read when you were young, many of them American writers. Who are the writers you're reading now? And maybe you can give the audience some names to go home with.
This is one question I always dread, because no matter how hard I prepare, the instant I'm asked this question, I draw a blank. It just, everything disappears. But, boy, I love Jennifer Egan's work, most of it. I like Ian McEwan very much. Salman Rushdie, for me, will always be the lodestar. I have not picked up a copy of his latest book yet. And after this, I'm drawing a blank.
I think that's a great list. Thank you so much,
Thank
Thrity.
you. Thank you. This was wonderful. Thanks.
Thrity will be signing books, I think, over here.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.